Welcome to the coffee break. As you're all aware, we've got a number of coffee breaks which are moving around up until Christmas. So our next scheduled coffee break will be on the 18th of November at 12:30, which is a Wednesday. And then there are 2 more coffee breaks before Christmas. But today, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Tolson to you all, who is going to talk about our Planners Ageist. And really, this is a fantastic subject for us to discuss because it's something we're all going to have to deal with it. Some more quickly than others. I'm the more quickly category. But Stephen has been involved in researching housing for the elderly for quite some time. And as you'll know from the flyer that came out for the talk, he's the joint author of Being Home, which is a review of planning policy in Scotland, and also looking generally at housing for the elderly, or older people rather, in Scotland and those suffering from dementia. Aging is an important factor, as I said, something that we can't avoid, and it's something we really must and should and are beginning to take more account of in terms of housing and the urban fabric. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much. Now the operation, yes, good. So I've got people to move the slides around, so hopefully all that will work. And good afternoon, everybody. Well, the title was Our Planners Ageist was a bit of a wind up, and those that know me will sort of understand that. But essentially, the real title is Are Old People Invisible? And I got that title from a good friend of mine who is significantly older than me, and he said, well, I've been invisible since I was 65. And then I said to my wife, oh, what about that for a title? And she said, and my wife is a professor of gerontology and dementia, so she knows kind of 1 or 2 things about older people. And she said, no, it's not that they're invisible, it's actually they just simply are looking in another direction. So I think that's kind of, in a way, if we go to the next slide, please, is what it's about. It's really, yes, it will be planners, but I think really ageism is a kind of societal issue, because I think we're all kind of ageist in many ways, unconscious or otherwise. And I think really part of that is the kind of way the world works these days. And there you see in some of my bullets, you know, marketing wise, anti-aging cream, you don't want to get old, let's stay young and that sort of thing. And then you've got somebody like Trump slagging off Biden by saying you're too old, and he's only like 2 or 3 years younger than Biden himself. We're just not really getting to grips with how we fund care. It's kind of ignored. People know it's there, but they're just not really stepping up to the plate. And this whole matter of socialization, people say, oh, I'll give you a call, I will get in touch with you. And I keep meaning to get in touch, but they don't. And it's all that kind of thing. And, oh, I'm too busy. So people are getting, older people are finding themselves far more isolated as we get into, well, for quite a long time now, for 30 plus years, we've become more individual rather than the collective. So it's all running against older people. Next slide, please. So what I would ask is, when you think, if I said older people, what is your image of an older people? Is it something like this? Or next slide, please. Or is it something like that? These 2 photographs, for those that are interested, was taken about 10 minutes apart in Nîmes. So in other words, if you look at the statistics that people like Scottish government put out, they would say you're an older person probably from the age of 60, some say 55, and so on. So if you think about it, there's always a good chance these days that you might live to 90, touching wood and so forth. And if you're 60, you've still got a third of your life to go. Next slide, please. But the problem is that we tend to look at older people as a liability, which brings this Equality Act 2010 into play, because it says you must not be discriminated against if you are a certain age. Now, I've personally encountered a Scottish planning officer's report for a planning application very recently, and I'll just look at that red underlined, and that's in the report: risks attracting increasingly elderly residents to an area. I was horrified when I read that, because essentially it's basically saying you shouldn't be coming into our area, you should stay where you are. Now, I think that's blatant ageism, frankly. You can't go around telling people you can't come to our district and so on. So it's essentially seeing older people as a liability. Next slide, please. So in the last couple of weeks, there's been a report published by the International Longevity Centre UK. They're a very, very good organisation. And this report, called Health Equals Wealth Report, touches upon that. It's a quote, I'll leave it there for you, but essentially it's dangerous rhetoric painting of older people as disposable. And I think it's just that negativity about a drag on society and a drag on economy and so on. Next slide, please. So what this report was saying was this notion that aging is a liability. But the truth of the matter is that you'll see there nearly a third of all those in the G20 countries are over 50, and it's going to be a lot more in the next 10, 15 years or so. And all these so-called older people are actually putting a hell of a lot of money into the economy. And without them, the economy would really, really struggle. So they're making a vital contribution. Next slide, please. But it's not just in terms of the money and the spend. As anybody of a certain age will know who are retired, there's an awful lot of caring going on with family, friends, partners and that sort of thing, and children, grandchildren, that sort of stuff. And a huge amount of volunteering. And in fact, what the report actually shows that they estimate around 1.4% of GDP is equal to the unpaid contributions of older people. Well, 1.4% might not seem much, but actually that's greater than agriculture in GDP terms. So it's quite significant. So the argument is that if we actually started to refocus about what can we do as what they term preventative health and invest in that side, and as I say there, 0.1% would increase annual spending by older people by 9% and create 10 more hours of volunteering. Next slide, please. So moving on to where this really starts to touch place. I mean, it touches place in a whole range of matters, but I'm going focusing on housing. I listened to the Minister of Housing and Planning, and he refers to we need more specialist housing for the elderly, and you'll see it written down in the odd policy statement as well. But actually, if you look at it, it's only, this so-called specialist housing is only 2% of all older people. That's 20,000 people. And actually, if you start to look at the detail in that, you'll actually find there's 31,223 older people living in care homes now. So in other words, there's hardly anybody in specialist housing. You'll work out, if you're sharp enough, to see 31,000 is more than the 20,000. So the maths are not quite right in the data there, but that's not unusual. So it's more and more, instead of seeing care homes, and we all know about the problems with care homes right in this very moment with COVID and so on, but we have to look for other solutions. And so rather than just having a review of care homes, we need to look at it in the context of housing and what the right suitable housing is for older people. Next slide, please. So a few graphs just to illustrate the point. So 72% of all older people in Scotland live in houses that they own. That's 751,784 people, according to the Scottish Government. And a third of those would like to move. And if you can see it in that graph, you can see what 2% of special use housing is. It's hardly showing on the graph itself. Next slide, please. So in total population, we've got 1.7 million, 1.8 million over 55, and this is a product essentially of the baby boomers. And over the next 20 years, as a consequence of the baby boomers, that population is going to grow by 40%. And those who were over 75 are essentially going to rise, well, pretty much double the population. So those by 2040, 15% of all of Scotland's population will be over 75. That's quite a significant figure, because that's when frailty and comorbid conditions and so on will start to take place, and that's when it'll hit the public purse, amongst other things. But we're not taking much action. Next slide, please. And there it is in graph form. You can see there on the right-hand side in red the total for 2043, and you can see in the 75 plus bar that significant increase. Whereas if you look at the left-hand side bar at 55 to 64, the actual population over the next 20 years or so will decrease, and that's a function of the baby boomers. Next slide, please. In the summer, Age Scotland did a survey about how many people would actually want to move. Essentially, what we've got in public policy in Scotland is that people want to stay in their own home. And that might be true for a lot of people, but the research wasn't terribly good. Well, Age Scotland have gone and done this survey, and they've found that something like 37% of people of an older age, and that's from 55 on, by the way, would like to move. So I did a little calculation of what that might be. And you can see in the middle block there on the purple that it's over 600,000 people in Scotland would prefer to move. And if you convert that to dwellings, because there's about 1.37 older people households, 1.37 persons in a household, then it means that we're probably looking at something like 400,000. Not all of those are new, of course, because they moved to another house, but we haven't got what I would call age-appropriate housing. Next slide, please. So the final slide, or the penultimate slide here, is just to illustrate what we have actually done in the last 30 years or so. So if you can concentrate on the light blue bars in those blocks and look at the left-hand side in detached, that's what we've been building since 1982. 41% of all new build is detached houses. Now, I know it's a bit stereotypical, but bungalows are favoured by older people because they're on one level, and we only do about 2%. It's so small, I couldn't even get it on the graph, you wouldn't see it. So we seem to have a problem now. And I think the problem is partly to do with the fact that planning hasn't really ever got itself involved in what types of housing are being built in its policy. Partly because I think of politics and this sort of fascination with numbers. We will build 50,000 houses, or we're going to build 20,000 in Scotland, or whatever, and politicians get into a bidding game, and you look out for that in the manifestos for the forthcoming Scottish Parliament, because that's what will happen. But how many people are actually talking about what type of housing? And what type of housing for older people? What type for young people to get on the ladder? And so on. You don't hear it, but we need to do that. And I think it's a fundamental missing aspect of planning policy. Final slide, please. So my plea is to sort of, here you are, a nursery rhyme to finish for you. It's the wise old owl sat in an oak, the more he saw, the less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we be like that wise old bird? Comes from Punch magazine of 1875. Now, I find that what we really need to do is, and I have vested interest, and there'll be people today here who will be of similar age to me or even older. these people have got great levels of wisdom and experience, and we need to use more of that. I was saying before we all met, I rarely ever see anybody of my age or older in the public sector because they've all sort of retired and they've gone away. And Nick said he found that the people who stay, keep working at it, are the creative types because they are passionate about it, and it's not just doing it for the pension, although the creative types probably need to work because the pension's rubbish. So I think really what we do need is we see that people, older people, do give something back and do help people rather than and see things as a liability. And I'd really like to see that being framed up now in public policy far more than it has been so far. So that's my end, my sell for the value and worth of older people. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. What a fantastic talk, and lots of figures to take on board there and think about. I was just trying to get my head around all the different issues that are encompassed in what you are speaking about. I think the first statistic that I found interesting was the 600,000 people over 65 who actually own their own properties, and why, when you drill down into why they want to move house, what is it that they want to move to, or why do they want to move? Is it location, or is it just the fact that the properties can't be adapted? And then my second sort of observation was, I've come across it myself actually. When you go and do community consultations, I do a lot of social housing in my day job, and most people's favorite house is a detached bungalow, but evidently from a social housing point of view, there isn't the funding to be able to afford that. But also, I suppose it comes down to location, and in an inner city location, we need to live in a denser way. So I'm wondering if, with a lot of the issues we're dealing with in society, it's not one size fits all. There's a whole variety of different types of the aging population, as you discussed yourself. So what's my question, I wonder? What do we do?
Well, you asked, you first of all, you asked, why do people want to move? And by the way, it's 3/4 of an easy number to think about. It's 3/4 of a million people in Scotland who are old, over 65, own their own property. That's the number. And what we're saying is it's about just over 600 are interested in moving. Some of these stats flow around because we're mixing stats, and a purist would say, oh, you can't do that, and so on. So it's kind of a snapshot and a bit of a flavor. But to answer your question about people wanting to move, yeah, I mean, essentially, older people are under-occupying their properties by quite significant margin.
Yeah.
Some people are quite happy about that. But, if you were, well, my own place here, I mean, I would move tomorrow. I have plenty of rooms, far too many rooms. And it's not appropriate for me to live in a house of this size. But there's absolutely no chance of me finding a house to fit my requirements, and they are a little bit different. For those that can see the video, there's a black thing sticking there, which is a grand piano. So I need my living room to be kind of 8 meters by 5 or something. And if I went to buy something from Wimpy Homes, I wouldn't get it through the door, let alone into the room. So that's my personal circumstance. But a lot of people need different things, but they're not available in what I would call age-appropriate housing. So yeah, I mean, if you are, anecdotally, I had a person, some people in Lenzie approached me. They wanted to do co-housing, senior co-housing. And they went down to see a housing development down the road, see if they could get some land off them. And the person on the site said, oh, no, you don't want to do that. You want to be buying our 5-bedroom detached house, because then you can have all the grandchildren to come to live. And it's this kind of using this property in a very inefficient way, which would cost a lot of money just to keep something empty. So, and I think most people, typically I'm living in a house, I work from home because of lockdown. And because I'm from Yorkshire, I'm switching the central heating off within the first half hour. Yeah, exactly. So I'm living in a bloody cold house. And I'd love to live in a modern house, passive house, which I don't even have to switch the heating on because my body heats enough to generate the right ambient temperature. I'd love to live in a brand new house, but there is no opportunity for me to do that.
Perhaps all you need to do is find an architect who can build you that house. But with that in mind, I'm going to pass you over to Andrew. And Andrew's got a question for you. But before he asks his question, he says that you gave a good talk for an old person.
Well, thanks very much.
Andrew.
No,
I don't need a reply. Thank you, Stephen.
Takes one to know one.
No, I just wondered, it's perhaps a bit of a follow-up to what Nick's just, his question, but in terms of the 600,000, etc., do you have any, did the survey bring out anything to do with what sort of sectors this older group would be attracted to? What I'm really getting at is that we although, 75% live in their own owner-occupied premises.
Yeah.
There's often a temptation to say that, well, they just want to buy something again, something smaller or different or what have you. And I just wondered whether that was the case or whether there's a willingness to change tenures.
Well, that's a good, interesting question. There has been evidence of people switching tenures when I've spoken to people like Hanover and Beeld housing associations who specialise in older people's property, a bit with Link and Castle Rock as well. And I've actually asked that question of them, and they said yes, they have found quite a number of people from the owner-occupied sector trying to get into social housing, what they call now amenity housing or extra care, and they've got all different titles for it. People of our vintage would have called it sheltered housing. Whatever they want to call it, doesn't matter. What matters is their ability to get access to these social housing, because as I'm sure everybody knows, you have to qualify to do that. And if you turn up and you've got an asset of, I don't know, £300,000-400,000, you're not going to be top of the list. So the alternatives are pretty limited, and 70% of the UK market in older people's property is in McCarthy and Stone.
Yeah.
And McCarthy and Stone, as I'm sure people know, are leaving Scotland.
Are they?
Oh yes, they've been leaving Scotland for a year. They're just building out what they've got. And one of the people from McCarthy and Stone who moved on and I asked why that was, and the simple answer was planning is too difficult in Scotland. And a big corporate organisation like that will quickly work out that they can generate more profit from their Birmingham office than their Scottish office. So plug is pulled.
So Stephen, what is it then? Are the planners ageist, or are the planners just interested in, this is a slightly confrontational question here, but good design? I mean, I know a lot of the McCarthy Stone type of offers are single aspect dwellings, and are, pack as many onto the site as possible and then put in a champagne swilling living space and everyone's happy. Is it actually to do with the fact that they're not up to standard, or they're just in the wrong places in terms of,
Well, there's a lot of questions there. Well, let me take your first point. Planners ageist. Well, they are, but my point was we all are to a degree. And if you think about it, if you look at that, the housing need and demand assessment, which is a terrible document and a terrible thing. It's a formulaic mechanistic approach, and it makes an assumption that people don't move around. So it's not just older people not being able to move around. It's pretty limited in how it works out, where the demand is. I mean, it says need and demand, but it's essentially a need-driven exercise, and makes an assumption that we all stay put within our own districts, which is wrong. It's clearly wrong. It might be less so, perhaps certain parts of the population will not move around as much. But in private housing, you know, you can only think of your own personal circumstances. In my personal circumstance, I've moved home 5 times. I've owned 5 different houses. That's before that's after I rented places and my family home. So I've owned 5 houses. I've owned 3 in Scotland in 30 years. So, you know, I don't know whether I'm atypical or not. But generally speaking, in house building, the statistic used to be, I'm not up to date on this, but people would move house every 7 years. And it's probably still around that kind of figure, I suspect, although that's a pretty historic figure that I'm using there. So I think we don't recognize that. The planners certainly don't recognize that the world has moved on and people are very mobile. You know, people listening to this conversation right this very moment will, some of them of a certain age will have children. Where are your children? Do they live around the next street like they used to do in the 1950s? No, I don't think so. They might not even live in the same country. My son lives in the Lake District. Some of my friends' sons live in New Zealand. The whole fact of the matter is we're massively mobile now. And planning just doesn't reflect that in its policies. It just looks at what it can cope with, because it's a difficult thing to do. How do you measure that mobility when everybody is working individually, moving around all over this? It's a pretty difficult task. That's kind of, what was your other point? I can't remember the other point.
I can't even remember who the last point was. Was it me or was it Andrew?
No, it was your point. It was your point.
Well,
essentially, it's a mobility thing, and it's this factor of people moving around. You know, for that particular planner to say, "Oh, we don't want any more older people in our community. Thank you very much, because we've got limited resources as it is." Well, you know, there could be people in that particular district who've got an aging mother in Inverness, who they want to come and live around the corner from. Are they saying that they can't come? That's simply not right. And it's a disadvantage, and it's right in putting their nose right against the Equalities Act, frankly, I think.
Do we have any more questions on the floor? Anybody? Andrew's coming back.
I was just wondering, what Stephen, how you feel technology can play. What role can technology play in here? I've always been astonished that, you know, people will overspend on a McCarthy and Stone house because it's, you know, inverted commas, sheltered. But you know, and I think if I'm not mistaken, McCarthy and Stone's rules used to be that one person in a if it's a couple, one person has to be 50, minimum 50. So what that to my mind means that, you know, middle-aged couples are going into sheltered housing, which sounds a wee bit frightening, frankly. But technology's changed a great deal. And do you need sheltered housing anymore?
Well, can I add to that before you answer? Because I think this sort of leads into this whole idea of siloing and putting, you know, people together because they're the same age or they earn the same amount of money. And I mean, I suppose the way we're moving in our world of design is towards lifetime homes, and homes that people can stay in longer and that can adapt. So that, you know, I mean, for example, I've recently been working quite a bit in Langside, and a lot of the people who live in Langside live in tenements, and they love their tenements, but they can't manage the stairs anymore. So they don't want to leave the area. They just want to live in a flat that's got a lift, but they're still quite happy being surrounded by, you know, young families and what have you. So some of that is, I'm not quite sure how that is all quantified to find out exactly who wants what. And if it's the private sector, then presumably some of that's got to just do with the market.
Well, okay. Well, let me have a go at some of these things. The first thing I would say is a good planning system would enable everyone to have choice. And I would suggest that that's not happening. So it's not saying we should just build sheltered housing or whatever housing you want to describe it as. And every single older person goes into these houses. That's not the right thing to do. But it might be right for certain people. So it's not one size fits all. It's being able to have different choices. To pick up your point, do we need sheltered? You make an interesting point there. I almost in a sense answered your own question by saying it's the name thing. And I'm going back to one of my early slides, which said about, you know, anti-aging cream. We don't want to be associated. Nobody of bus pass age want to really accept that they're getting old, and they much prefer to think that they're still 20. And I remember my father saying that when he was in his 60s, and he said, well, my mind's 22, and but my body's 60. It's kind of this issue about not really wanting to be old. And if you suddenly went into sheltered housing, that's labeled you as old. So you kind of try and avoid it as much as possible. And interestingly, there is a view. If you look at the care homes, there are two types of care home. There's a residential care home and there's a nursing care home. And the view is people want to be associated with residential and not nursing, because it not only labels them as old, but it labels them as completely knackered because they need nurses to look after them. So this is a psychological issue and barriers floating around here with the names. And I think that's why sheltered disappeared in social housing terms and became amenity housing, or and there are various other names. So they changed the names, but you can't fool people all the time on that. So I think it's about choice. There are, you know, if you went to New Zealand, 16% of all older people in New Zealand live in retirement communities, whereas in Scotland we've only got 3, and in England we've got 300. It's relatively small. So there are whole different things. McCarthy and Stone essentially is a house builder's offer, if I could put it that way, for older people. But it isn't designed to address the requirements of older people. It's just cellular, 40, 50 square meters, 1-bed flat, and that's your lot. Technology was raised by Andrew. Yes, technology can do a lot, and lots of people are getting involved in that in quite a significant way. Again, I would just offer a note of caution about technology, and that is that all human beings are social animals. And as much as we might want to do a beautiful Japanese robot, which looks almost like a human being, you cannot replace human contact. And that's a really vital point. I do, from time to time, valuations for funds on shared equity. So I go in about once a month or so before COVID got involved, and I do valuations of people's houses. So all these people tend to be, more often than not, over 80. More often than not, just about everyone is single. I could do that valuation in 15 minutes flat. But what happens is I end up being there for an hour and a half, because we have a blether. They want to have a talk, and I'm really interested in hearing what people say. So my knowledge bank of what really drives older people is quite significant, based on 2 dozen, 3 dozen people I speak to every year, and they just simply want to talk to me because that's probably the only person they're going to meet other than their carers in the whole week. And the carers, they don't talk to the carers. I was in the last time and the carers came in, bish, bash, bosh, straight out, not a word spoken, there's your tea, and that's it. So we've got to think about the human contact, because people are absolutely lonely in older life, and particularly later, older life, for people who are beyond 80 and frail and can't get out and can't drive a car and all that sort of stuff.
Thanks, Stephen. We've got another couple of two more questions coming in. So the first one is from Ian. Ian, do you want to unmute yourself, or do you want me to ask the question?
It's just, I mean, it's the more general, and it came up in a couple of other things you said, Steve, about planners' generality, is they don't plan anymore. They don't look at population and needs and demands and so on, and then say, right, well, this is where we need to allocate things and so on. Actually, although it is very difficult to get planning permission, it's mainly bureaucratic shit you have to jump through. As long as you click all the boxes, every fucking consultant that they want to call in, from fire to, whatever, they never actually make a judgment. Planners never say, we've got all this useful information about fire, about water, about things like this. Now I have to draw it together and make a judgment. No, they don't. They just need you to tick the boxes and get the box ticked in the way. So it's really effing difficult to get, but it produces really shit results. And actually they've abandoned, and I don't entirely blame them. There are hardly any of them left, and they're badly trained, and they're worse led, because the politicians are the people who say, well, the private sector is the best results. Only private profit produces good results. And of course, we end up where we are. So I think everything you say is right, but it's a much deeper question than just old people not being tracked well. Society is not being tracked by planners who are not anymore planning in a democratic way for the betterment of society. I mean, inside the existing system, I'm not talking about anything, just managing the process much better, as we clearly see in lots of other countries. I mean, this is not a utopian position.
Speaking of democracy, so I was just going to say, speaking of democracy, one of the things that's happening now is because the committees are now televised, I think planners are becoming even more risk averse, because obviously they're fully accountable. So that's having an effect.
Well, absolutely. I agree entirely with Ian. And, it's even I heard the chief planner say that planning is a reactive process. And I kind of think, well, let me just go to my English dictionary, shall I? And look up what it says about planning. Because how can planning be reactive? The very word, what does plan mean? It must mean a proactive activity. And you're right. Now, and I've written extensively on this in recent times. And you're right, Ian, it's essentially, you'll like this, Ian, anyhow. I mean, basically, planning was invented and became real in 1947 in the first Planning Act. And the reason it became 47, as everybody who knows the history will know, that was under the Labour reforming government of 45, and it was intended that the planning was the doing part of the welfare state. They were there to deliver that stuff and rebuild Britain after the war. And that's what they did. And they did that for best part of 30 years. And you had things like the new town developments, as people may recall. And all that was, and planners were heavily involved in all that stuff. And then in 1979, a certain individual came to power, and that started to fall away, and the market took over because they knew better. And planning stopped to plan and just became, as you say, a regulatory matter. And it's interesting what you say about the politicians saying the market works best. We have got a government here. We've had a government here for what, 13 years. I wouldn't have exactly said that they were of that sort of mindset of being right of centre, market orientated. So but you're right that the politicians have really reduced the influence of planning. And the final point on this is that people know that planning is not a particularly attractive profession to be in anymore, because it is a bureaucratic administrative process. then it's not going to attract good quality, skillful, creative people. Where's the opportunity to be creative in planning? Short answer to that is there isn't any. So you're just going to get the type of people that are more motivated by process, which is a bit sad.
Thank you. Nathan, do you want to finish up with one last question?
It's really the same kind of
Yeah.
continuation of the same point, really. We're delivering a number of affordable housing schemes, including ones with single story over 55 homes in them. And they're in really areas which are of lower land value, because it isn't such an impact delivering a single story home as it would be in a higher land value area. But trying to do that with a developer in an area where you try and convince them they're going to take half their profit because they want to deliver single story homes, there's no way that I could get that argument through, just based on the fact that there may be a need there, unless they can see some advantage. And that's where the doing part of planning really could come in and be proactive and have a mechanism in it which offsets the economic need, which is the prime driver, obviously, from what we're just saying, with some other form which is proactive and makes the delivery of homes a priority.
Well, yeah, I think the point there about the house builder can't afford to do it, I think it is a matter of, that's kind of function of the market.
Yeah.
And what the issue there is that no individual, well, it'd be very, very rare. Actually, if you go to McTaggart and Mickle did some bungalows at, what's that place, Eaglesham up at Polnoon, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There were bungalows. That's the only place I've seen with bungalows other than social housing. A certain unnamed large house builder said to me not long ago, I asked him a very simple question: how many retired people buy your houses? And he didn't waste much time in answering. He said, it's about 16%.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, now some of those would be flats, to be fair, but quite a lot of retired people are buying 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom detached houses. And if you take that stat, that means 1 in 6 people who, that particular house builder, 1 in 6 houses is selling to retired people. If there was a bit of research, if I was in charge of a research budget in Scottish government, I'd be going out and finding that question, answer to that question. And what are the retired people buying you a builder house? What type of houses are they? And I'd wager a bit of money on the fact that they are building houses, you know, that well, probably 2 households, say 65, between 65 and 70, are buying houses with multi-bedrooms in.
Yeah.
Just don't forget that the average size of the households these days is around 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at projections for household formation, which Scottish Government statistics have got. I didn't put it on the slide here, but within I think it's 10 years' time, single person households will be the majority. There'll be more people in single households than any other type of household. So that shows you where we're going. So what we've got, and then if you go back to my slide about the detached houses, 41% of all new build housing since 1982 is in detached. Then you can see there's a humongous mismatch between what we build and the size of household that we are.
Yeah, I agree that there's certainly a demand and the market to do it, but it's when the developer on a spreadsheet, not even looking at what the design is or interested in it, sees the bottom line, and that's
the motivation.
Exactly.
You know, I'm not going to blame a house builder for that. Why should you blame a house builder? The only people you can blame, essentially, blame's the wrong word, but you can challenge, is the planners, because the planners and the politicians have it within their power to shape the market in the way that would enable that type of housing, the appropriate housing, age-appropriate housing, to take place. It's down to them, not the house builder.
Yeah, it's just
Stephen, we need to wrap up now because we've got to the midnight hour when the dark has crept in. But we can finish up with this comment from Ian, which is any cost laid on a developer falls only on the landowner because they value acquisition price by development appraisal, in which the only entirely flexible variable is the land price. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, which has led to a very heated discussion with the most swearing I've heard in a coffee break so far, albeit one person.
I
think really what we're looking for is a more sort of proactive approach by planning for every type of person. To be honest, it is a one sort of solution for everybody. It makes me just think of the Netherlands, where we always tend to look for inspiration, but you start to see the housing models where, you know, students who can't afford to buy houses are living with elderly people who don't have any contact, and there's a sort of a contract between them just to provide some comfort. Or indeed some of these developments that have older people living near to nursery schools so they can help out with daycare. So it's those sort of more flexible models that will become interesting as we move forward. Thank you everybody for attending. I hope I did an all right job. Rachel will be back next week. Stephen, thank you very much for your time.